Hey guys, welcome to the show. Today I have a very special guest, John G. West. And we're going to be talking about a recent article he wrote in Clear Truth Media called The Tragic Legacy of Jimmy Carter. And one of the main reasons I want to talk about this is because in 2018, Jimmy Carter said some very alarming things about gay marriage. But also, we're going to get into his policies as a president and the aftermath of that. John G. West is vice president and senior fellow at the Seattle-based Discovery Institute, where he also serves as managing director of the Institute's Center for Science and Culture, which he co-founded with philosopher of science Stephen Meyer in 1996. Stephen Meyer's been on the show. His current research examines the impact of science and scientism on public policy and culture. His other areas of expertise include constitutional law, American government and institutions, and religion and politics. Happy to have him on the show. Welcome, John West.
Becket, thanks for having me on your show.
So let's talk about your recent piece in Clear Truth Media, The Tragic Legacy of Jimmy Carter, because when Jimmy Carter, he died, what, like a week and a half ago?
Yeah.
When he died, the New York Times, this is like this constant flow of, I think it was 13 to 14 pieces and counting, practically hailing him as the best president of all time. And I was so just, of course, the New York Times is going to do that. But your article kind of begs to differ. And so let's start with, you say that some of the retrospectives in the Christian community have bordered on hagiography, chief among them a piece written by David Swartz in Christianity Today, and also Russell Moore. And you say that both kind of omit the serious problems with Carter's record. So what prompted you to write this piece?
Yeah, you never like to speak ill of the dead, and especially when a beloved figure who've spent their life, and in many ways, Carter's personal life was admirable. He's faithful to his wife. He's apparently spent a lot of time with his kids, and I think he did personally have a faith in Christ, and so as a fellow Christian, I would respect that. So initially I didn't want to say anything about that because you don't want to speak ill of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have these what I consider absolutely over the top articles in Christianity Today and The Atlantic about Saint Jimmy, that really, in some ways, I think reflects more about the authors than they do about Jimmy Carter. That they're finding that they want to extol Jimmy Carter to justify some choices they've made. I just thought it was too much. At a certain point, even with a beloved figure who's just died, if they're being extolled with an agenda, say, to defend certain things today, you need to tell the truth. Because Jimmy Carter, as wonderful as a person he was in his personal life in some ways, in his public life, he was a really not a great example. And as a example of a Christian, say, statesman in politics, he's probably the last person you'd want to follow.
Yeah. And in one of the pieces, I think it was Swartz, he called Ronald Reagan a twice divorced Hollywood actor. And tell us what's wrong with that statement.
Yeah, well, first of all, the context here is that this is a standard secularist talking point, and from sort of center-left progressive Christians that they really are down on American evangelicals who didn't know what they had when they had it, and so they traded Saint Jimmy for a mess of pottage for this, lax Christian, sexually divorced guy because he sold them a bill of goods. And so that's the larger context. And so Christianity Today, David Swartz was making that. I mean, this guy was a historian at Asbury University. He should have done some elementary fact checking. So he called Reagan twice divorced. Well, no, Reagan was once divorced. And if you know anything about the reasoning of it was really tragic. He didn't want that divorce. He was divorced by Jane Wyman, who, for a variety of reasons, divorced him, and she had been committing adultery against him. He still wanted to take her back. I mean, he was completely distraught by that. So not only was he not twice divorced, he was once divorced. The time he was divorced, he didn't want it, and actually tried to counteract it. And for whatever you make of his second marriage, which lasted for decades, and I think there were some legitimate sort of tragic views of Reagan as how good or not he was as a dad. He was not this loose libertine person, and more than that, comparing Jimmy Carter, Sunday school teacher, to this lax Christian, and how dare these Christians in the 1980s sell out Jimmy Carter, who was their fellow person, who was a Sunday school teacher and a born again Christian, to this lax actor, is also, it's wrong on so many levels. The most basic level is, I actually think that, and I know we'll probably talk about this, but that policy is, and what you are as a public figure is probably the most important thing that Christians should look at. So whether or not Carter was devout in his personal life isn't sufficient reason to just rubber stamp and prefer him. But more than that, it really got my goat, as you could probably tell, because we now know that Reagan was really seriously devout. Now,
Hmm.
at the time, we didn't know quite as much, but the work of historian Paul Kenger, among others, some research I did just last year on an article, that he would have been described as himself a born again Christian who he loved. Actually, he would often, in letters, when people wrote to him uh, with their doubts, he would talk about C.S. Lewis's, Lord, lunatic, liar,
Liar.
trilemma, and as a reason why they should accept Christ. And then where it's really poignant, and what I found last year is most people, or many people who follow his family, know that his youngest son, Ron, is an atheist and has basically turned his back on that. But what you may not know is just how much that weighed upon Ronald Reagan. And we now know this because of the testimony of Ron's brother, Michael, but also because of some other materials that have been declassified. He spent some serious time trying to convince, he was very concerned about the salvation of Ron, and was trying to convince him back toward God. And
Hmm.
he had this interesting argument about, if you were invited to a feast and someone told you that there was, that it was created without a cook. I mean, that makes no sense. And just like our natural world, in the same way, it's sort of an argument from design. And in the last years of his presidency, he started to make this argument. And he apparently, I think, had made it with his son. But why we know that it weighed on with his son also is that in his ending meetings with Gorbachev, where he also tried to get Gorbachev to believe in God, he made this argument, and he actually opened up. We now know this because of the declassified descriptions of the conversations, where he opened up that he had a son who had turned away from God, and how it really, um, you know, he was very concerned about that. So we actually know that irrefutably, that Ronald Reagan was actually a very devout guy. And so it sort of gets me, these critiques that go back to the secular left and to have people like Russell Moore and Christianity Today, because Russell Moore made sort of a similar comment in his The Atlantic article, dissing Reagan's as a Christian is just contemptible in my view.
And just out of curiosity, this is kind of off topic, but did Nancy Reagan, did she have faith? Because I know she was kind of into astrology, but what was the deal with her faith? We don't know.
It wasn't as, I mean, I think she was conventionally a Christian. Her astrology and other stuff raised issues for Reagan. He wasn't into that. I think she was more over the map, but I mean, I think in some sense she probably thought she was a Christian, but I don't know that I could judge it. But with regard to Reagan, we have so much material from his private letters, from his interactions with people, that this wasn't just surface. He was really, it really moved him,
Yeah.
and a pretty doctrinally conservative. And so what he when he made overtures to, at the time, called the religious right and stuff, on, say, even evolution or other things, saying that it wasn't just an unguided process. those were actually coming out of some core convictions. It wasn't just playing to the choir. And, at the time, there were legitimate questions about that. But now, because we have so much evidence from his private life, we know that that was sincere.
And what about his church attendance? Because he,
Yeah.
in your article, you talk about how the reason why he didn't attend church during, I think, his second term or maybe throughout. But go talk about
Yeah.
that.
So yeah, they compare, Carter, who was devout church attender and taught Sunday school, and Reagan, who rarely attended church. Well, first of all, it's not true that he rarely attended church. Through most of his life, before and after the presidency, he did attend church, and he had a home church and had a relationship with the Pastor Mumma at Bel Air Presbyterian. I mean, so that's not true. It is true that while president, he was an irregular churchgoer. But what he told people, and was genuinely true, was especially after his assassination attempt against him in just the first couple months of his presidency, what you have to put churchgoers through for the president to attend church is a huge production. I mean, everyone else has to get searched. I mean, it
Mhm.
draws the attention on you. It draws against worship of God. It becomes a circus, and he didn't like that.
Yeah.
So, so now people can say, "Oh, that's just a cheap explanation." But the reason why it's not is, again, if you look at his life before he was president and after, church was something that he was serious about. So.
Yeah. And so let's move to some of the policy stuff. What is the White House Conference on Families initiated by Carter, and
Yeah.
how did that play out when he was
So
president?
yes, Carter, of course, he got a lot of evangelical support when he ran in 1976, partly because there was Watergate going on, because he was very upfront that he believed in Jesus, and he was from the South, so he could speak that language. So there were a lot of people hoping for things, despite the fact that if you even looked at his policies that he ran on, it wasn't quite that. So early on, we're going to help the American family. So it started out as the White House Conference on the Family. It then morphed into White House Conference on Families because one of the first big brouhahas was, well, how do you define a family?
Mm,
And the people that he was bringing together, a lot of them did not want to define the family in a way that was, say, just related by marriage or adoption or other things. They wanted it pretty much any two or more people gathered together. And in fact, the joke of some of the conservatives at the time, but it was a joke, but there was some truth to it, is that by the definitions that were being put forward, Charles Manson's family would be a family, anyone living together as a group. Now, I will say that that was such a off-tone thing, and conservative activists like Phyllis Schlafly and others organized so effectively at some of the grassroots meetings that they were able to turn that away, even though they
mhm.
still called it White House Conference on Families. They actually, in the end, they didn't offer a definition of the family the conservatives sort of won that, but that was an eye-opening experience to many of them that Carter, this great, gospel-oriented Christian, was creating the stalking horse for redefining the family. Now, other things came out of it that were awful. So the White House Conference on Families was actually three conferences in under that title in
Mhm.
various cities. One in Maryland, one I think on the West Coast, and I forget where the third one was. So two of the three conferences passed recommendations, promoting abortion, promoting the Equal Rights Amendment, which many people had concerns that turned out to be legitimate, that was so broadly about not discriminating based on sex that could be used as a stalking horse to redefine marriage and other things, which turned out to be right. That language courts later did. I mean, it's bad language. So they recommended that. So there were bad things that came out of that, and there were the experts that they brought in poo-pooed the idea that the family was in a crisis, and that the idea that the two-parent family was sort of should be the standard, was that they poo-pooed that, and so it was a wake-up call to many evangelicals, because it showed that the type of family values that Carter, whatever his personal values were, that he was aligned to in the policy community, the people he was tapping out of the left wing of the Democratic Party, was going in a completely different direction than what most conservative, theologically conservative evangelicals
Yeah,
were
and
doing.
also you talk about in your piece that Carter appointed a number of extreme cultural progressives to the federal courts, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and also
Yeah.
Stephen Reinhardt. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, this is too often not discussed. And Carter appointed when a lot of really left-wing progressives to the court system. Now, fortunately, he didn't get to appoint anyone to the Supreme Court, but he appointed a lot of district court and appellate court judges. And this is where you begin to see where the people who defend Carter say, well, yeah, he was a Democrat, he was sort of economically liberal, but he was pro-life. Okay, Carter was personally pro-life,
Hmm.
but his policies were not pro-life. And yes, policy-wise, Carter said that he wasn't in favor of taxpayer-funded abortion, but he appointed judges that believed the opposite. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg made a name for herself as a counsel for the ACLU, and so he tapped her as an appellate judge for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most important under the Supreme Court, probably maybe the most important federal appellate court. That's from which a later president chose her as for the Supreme Court. But she was elevated to an appellate court judge by Carter. She was on record at her view was that the Hyde Amendment restrictions on federal funding for abortions were unconstitutional because, in her view, not only did you have a constitutional right to abortion, which is historically not true, the Constitution doesn't provide that right, but you had a constitutional right to a taxpayer funded abortion because otherwise that would be sex discrimination. And so that the taxpayer, and so although Carter publicly said he was against taxpayer funded abortions, except for some exceptional cases, he appointed people to the judiciary who, if they got their way, would have made sure that that was impossible. So this is why I have a hard time being all that sympathetic to people who say, well, but Carter was a sincere when it came to pro-life personally. I can't read the state of his heart. What I do know is he appointed people who are advocating the opposite. And then Stephen Reinhardt was appointed by the time he retired. He was known as the liberal lion of the federal courts. He was so left wing. He thought there was a constitutional right to assisted suicide. He wrote one of the opinions striking down a partial birth abortion ban. So late term abortions, killing babies that if they were born they would be born alive. This guy was really extreme. Well, we can thank Carter for that. And there was Patricia Wald. I mean, there were a lot of others, but those I just gave two examples. And that did incalculable damage in our judicial system for decades.
Yeah, and he also you talk about how his opinions on gay marriage, and I just want to quote what he said about gay marriage. He said Jesus would approve of gay marriage, and he said, "quote I think Jesus would encourage any love affair if it was honest and sincere." I can't even read this because it's too crazy. If it was honest and sincere and was not damaging to anyone else, and I don't see that gay marriage damages anyone else. Um, this came out, I think he made these statements in 2018, and I
Right.
remember just being absolutely flabbergasted when I heard this. I was like, this is Jimmy Carter? Like because I was just told, he was a Sunday
Yeah.
school teacher, blah blah blah. And I'm like, so what talk about that a little bit. What do you think happened to him and how did he come to that conclusion?
So going back to his time as president, when many people don't realize that just how radical the sexual revolution had become by the end of the 70s, and that many of the things that basically got implemented later under Obama and maybe under the end of President Clinton we were on the cusp of. I mean, the professional endorsement of pedophilia. I mean, all sorts of things. If you read in the late 1970s, and so there was also a push for gay rights then, not complete gay marriage, but gay rights. And Carter was open to that already in the end of the 70s, 80s. What delayed it by a decade was 8 years of Reagan. basically, we were, I would say, where we were on with the cusp of Obama in 1979. If Carter had been reelected, we would have gotten where we got a lot sooner. Basically, a lot of the really radical things got either pushed back or at least stalled, and then they re-resurrected. So Carter was somewhat sympathetic towards certain gay rights issues early on, not gay marriage. By the early 2000s, let's say 2015, he was talking about civil ceremonies that he supported, and then 2018 he went sort of full hog. So I mean, it wasn't a radical departure for him. I think you could see the trajectory, and for him, he talked a lot about his feelings, and
Mhm.
so and in fairness, by 2018 he was in his 80s, so I mean, I guess we could try to cut him some slack. I'm mainly, the reason I'm pushing back is not that he's some great villain, it's that we have these Christians like Russell Moore and others who are extolling him as this example of what a faithful Christian should be in politics. And that's just not true. That's just palpably false. I mean, that's just not true. So it's not that I want to blame him for everything. People are mixed up. We're all sinful. We're not all consistent. But let's give me a break. This is not someone who you should be extolling as the example that we should all follow. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And but I mean, for me personally, it was just like I just felt when he made those statements, I felt like how many thousands and thousands or millions of people are is he leading astray by these statements? And so that really disturbed me. That was disturbed me to the core, really.
Yeah, I mean, he's validating it, and he had a huge stature, and so with that he had a huge responsibility, and I don't think he followed it well, and
Yeah.
I think that is tragic. And when he says, Jesus would support any love affair that doesn't, hurt anyone else, but also his way of framing that is. I mean, I'm not obviously. I actually do think that there are Christians and who have been very unloving to the gay community. Having grown up on the West Coast among evangelicals, I'll say that I just haven't found that character even going back to the 1980s. But I accept that because I know, and Carter came from the South, so he had a different area. But I mean, the primary reason not to want something like gay marriage, it's hurtful for all concerned, and for the parties involved who think let alone kids and other things. I mean, there are downstream consequences, and so this is not about vilifying anyone, but it's just how unfortunate for him to frame it that way, and also help feed into the rhetoric of any Christian who disagrees with them. I mean, he didn't say this, but he was helping to feed into the rhetoric that you must be unloving, or if you don't take that view. That's the sort of subtle or not so subtle, undercurrent in comments like that.
Yeah, and so, and also, I mean, I've talked about this before on the show, but it's in supporting gay marriage or affirming homosexual behavior, it's part and parcel of kind of tearing at the fabric of the family, which when you do that, as Marx and Engels wanted to do so desperately, when you do that, it has this, massive ripple effect on society. And we see that obviously today. So it's not just kind of an innocent thing. Oh, if love is love. Love is love. I mean, there are consequences to that.
But and I'm glad you brought that up. That is true. And I would say, now that I think of it some more, you could see the roots of this again back in the Carter in the 70s, because in the 70s, one of the debates in the Conference on the Family wasn't so much directly about gay marriage, but it was, well, is it wrong to extol the two-parent family as what we want to try to cultivate, as opposed to, if single people want to have, if this, that, and and so there you began to see more liberal Christians being unwilling to say, again, it's different. You don't want to demonize anyone, and a lot of people who I get, single women or single men who've been abandoned by their partners or spouses,
Mhm.
they're being sinned against, and they're trying to do their best in a very challenging situation. But that's different than validating and saying, oh, well, there are, 10 different valid ways of having family that's equally good for everyone, and that we should be happy that there's so much diversity and that we have, like in the Black community, 60-70% of children born out of wedlock, and the white community, 20-30%. That's perfectly fine. And it's not loving to say otherwise. So what I guess I'd point out is that the Christians who began to sacrifice on this issue, it ended up, well, it actually doesn't end up in gay marriage, because as we know, then it goes to transgenderism, then it
Mhm.
goes to even other things. But you could already see in the 1970s the unwillingness to say that, well, no, it would really be good for kids to, it's best to have a dad and a mom
Yeah.
in a loving, committed, faithful relationship. And Christians like Carter in the 70s and 80s were getting squeamish about defining the family in that way. And this is where it leads. Our current culture is where it leads. So it doesn't start with gay marriage.
Yeah. And you talk about in your piece, you talk about how Schwartz, I want to say Schwartz, but it's Schwartz, suggests that Carter's disastrous presidency was foisted on him by outside events over which he could do nothing. Quote, events, this is so crazy too. Events beyond the meanwhile, keep in mind he's the president of the United States. Events beyond his control, notably a stagnant economy, high inflation, and diplomatic crises in Afghanistan and Iran, limited his effectiveness in office and sabotaged his campaign for re-election. Isn't the president of the United States supposed to lead the country? I mean, how is this foisted upon him?
So look, I'm sympathetic in theory with the point the president is not God, is not the almighty figure that controls everything. And so it is true that presidents often get dealt a stack of cards, a deck of cards that they weren't responsible for making, and then they have to do their best with it. But this is like, it's so deja vu. I mean, this goes back decades. This is like the standard. I mean, I shouldn't be so, I don't want to be mean to Professor Schwartz, but this is like, this is so old hat. I mean, this is the trite stuff they were saying in the end of the 70s, early 80s. And it's just, we know so much more now that this is just absolutely not true. And we even knew enough at the time. So let's just take these crises. Uh, well, let's take Afghanistan. Carter spent the first several years of in the first years of his administration appeasing the Soviet Union, and that's why we had the basically opening the floodgates of the Soviet Union funding communist revolutions in Central America, right on our doorstep, creeping up toward Mexico, in Africa, all around the world, exporting their revolution all around the world, and we were basically not doing that much to go against it. And Carter had this naive notion that he could just live in love with these people. And so how did they pay him back? Well, Afghanistan blew up and Russia, Soviet Union invaded, I think in part because they knew or they thought that, Carter was this paper tiger and, they didn't respect Carter. So that was part of his own making. Now, once they invaded Afghanistan to prop up their failed Marxist regime there, Carter was entering an election year and he flipped the switch and suddenly became, Mr. Anti-Communist in the last year of his life. But let's be honest, he was reaping what he sowed. And so I think that when it comes to Soviet aggression in Afghanistan and elsewhere, the idea that it was just all, oh, poor Carter, it was all foisted on him. No, he helped make the bed. I mean, he helped to. And then when it comes to probably the worst, most catastrophic failure of his administration that we are now living with today. And this is the other thing most people don't understand when it comes to foreign policy. They hear about the Middle East, they think of the Camp David peace accords, which I think are honorable, is good, what Carter tried to do. But his failure with Iran and his kowtowing to Islamic radicalism and thinking that it could be tamed and it was fine, uh, that built the world we live in today with where the Middle East is a mess, where Iran is really causing havoc all around the world, where other groups like the Hamas are. That is the world Jimmy Carter helped create. It wasn't just foisted on him. And with the Shah of Iran we now know, enough evidence has come out after the fact that not only did he push out the Shah,
Hmm.
and the Shah was authoritarian, no doubt about that, but he basically, now there's some argument over this, but there seems to be good evidence that we encourage the military to not oppose Khomeini coming in and taking over. And because after the Shah left, they did have a democratically represented assembly. They had a prime minister, Bakhtiar, and we basically abandoned them. And it turns out there were a lot of messages from Khomeini promising, "Oh, everything's going to be fine. I'm not going to hate America. I'm not going to do this." And apparently, we facilitated that. Now, there's some dispute over how much we did, but so again, on that, this is not something that's foisted on Jimmy Carter. This is something his poor decision making, his utopian, I'd say non-Christian ideas of human perfectibility, um, also played into this naivete. I mean, Christians should believe that we're sinful, and that should lead to some sense of realism. And Carter did not have that when it came to really bad guys. For all of his talk about human rights, he kowtowed with some of the absolute worst people.
Yeah, I remember also in terms of inflation and the energy crisis. I remember as a little kid, I was in Dallas, Texas, these long lines to get gas at the gas station. And Carter's famous response to the energy crisis was wear a sweater. So talk about that. Talk about that whole
Yeah.
debacle.
So, I mean, this is interesting of, the pitfalls of progressive politics. So, obviously, so we're not in complete control over obviously what's happening around the world and in oil production.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the United States has a lot of its own things to produce, and there are lots of ways to encourage oil production. So, one of the first things Ronald Reagan did was to try to basically decontrol so that you could have market pricing of oil, which everyone thought, oh, that's going to mean that the prices go through the roof. Well, temporarily that can feed that, but what it actually fed was a massive push to do more oil and gas exploration, which long term brings down inflation. And so I would say that the oil crisis that led to higher gas and energy things obviously had predated Carter. Carter didn't do the right things to solve it. When Reagan took the approach that he did, which was more free market approach, that did end up solving. So I would, even though I don't think the president is God, I do think the policies a president pursues does matter, and you can see that with oil and gas pricing because post Reagan, and then we saw something like this actually in the first administration of Trump. You actually find you don't actually have to have catastrophically high fuel prices. That this is engendered not just because of what other bad actors are doing, but by stupid economic decision making on our own.
Mhm.
So,
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that his statement, that comment he made, wear a sweater, was one of the main contributors to his not being reelected. I mean, I think because I remember that was just such a shock to the American people.
yeah. I mean, in fairness to him, he was, I want to say he was channeling Gerald Ford. I mean, I was a kid at the time, but Gerald Ford with his new whip inflation now, win slogan. And, these people didn't really have a clue because they didn't really want to have a market economy. And so they were at the mercy, both Ford and Carter, when it came to economic policy. And in fairness to Carter, there were a few places like deregulation of trucking and the airline industry for all the troubles of the airline industry. It became way more competitive. Actually, there were a few things economically early on that he did that were actually quite sensible. And I'd encourage people, my friend from years ago, Steve Hayward wrote a magisterial two-volume series on Reagan, The Age of Reagan. Basically, it was one and two. The first one has a section all about Carter, and I think it gives a good, a fair understanding of Carter. of both good for ill. And economically, there were some things, before he sort of got co-opted so by the left, that he did some saying things that were beneficial, but then he didn't really. He really sort of went to the other side. It's also a good book to read. I didn't get to this in my article. I didn't want to be perceived as being nasty, but how should I put it? This image of Saint Jimmy being this humble, wonderful Christian guy who loved everyone. How shall we say it? When he was in politics, some people talked about his mean streak because he would attack them as racist or do other things. I mean, he would go for the jugular. And in fact, again, in the age of Reagan, this is documented. He was not so even if you're just talking at a personal level of how he treated political opponents, there are some challenges there. And then one last thing, which almost no one talks about, but one of the campaign posters when Jimmy Carter was elected, and I don't know, maybe he didn't create this, but I do know because I saw a picture of him next to it, so he definitely knew about them, was titled JC Can Save America, and it had a picture of Jimmy Carter in a beard as if he was Jesus. Now think about this. I mean, if I'm a humble Christian, I mean, the thing that would, if I saw that, JC Can Save America dressing me up as Jesus, I'd tear it down. I mean, that's blasphemous.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just, again, I take him at his word that he was a sincere Christian, but I mean, that's just appalling. I
Yeah.
mean, so.
Yeah. And so the biggest, I think one of the biggest deals in his presidency, and one of the biggest reasons Ronald Reagan won in the landslide was the hostage crisis. How did explain to people who don't remember and who may not know at all, how did the hostage crisis in Iran begin and how did it end?
Yeah, I'm not an absolute expert on all that, so but in general, Carter again pushed out the Shah of Iran, basically made sure, apparently, that the military wouldn't oppose Ayatollah Khomeini, this extremist, Islamist who wanted to completely destroy Israel and just really nasty piece of work and impose Sharia law, and that they wouldn't oppose him coming to power. And the Khomeini was sending messages to say, "Oh, I'm going to love America. We won't stop oil. We won't do this." But as soon as Khomeini comes to power, it's a different um, it's a different world. And so, part of it, I think, was, and I guess I'd give some credit here, was that the Shah was dying of cancer. They were trying to
Mhm.
get us to extradite him. I think we refused. And so I think that's good. And so that's a number of reasons that things soured pretty quickly after this new regime that we helped install came in. And so then there were these mass demonstrations fomented by the government against our embassy, especially when we wouldn't hand over the Shah. And ultimately, those student demonstrators who were really, put up to it by the government took over. And I mean, this is an amazing, I mean, really horrific thing where a government entity takes over, your embassy is supposed to be your foreign country ground. I mean, this is to take over the full embassy and hold all those people hostage. This is just like it should be beyond belief. In fact, I can't think of anything. I mean, you could go to, I guess, a place like Mogadishu or things, but I mean, just in general, this shouldn't happen. And so, um, I think Carter wasn't responsible for the hostages being taken, as in the day they were taken. He was responsible for creating the situation where you had a government that did it.
Mhm.
And then
And by
basically,
the way, there were 400,
yeah,
how
400.
many hostages were there?
I think 414 or something, 400 and some.
Okay.
I once actually, out of college, I interviewed Colonel Schaefer, who was one of the people who was there, and it was an interesting experience. I can't remember a lot of my interview with him. I was in college for a student newspaper, but he was quite an admirable person. But
And so why
it,
were the hostages uh, detained for 444 days while Jimmy Carter was president.
Well, again, I think I'm not, my expertise is not foreign policy, even though I used to be a political science professor. I think it had a lot to do with our unwillingness to hand over the Shah and other things. And so,
Okay.
they were holding them hostage to get additional things from us that we, to our credit, weren't willing to give. So I mean, it's not so much that I fault Carter for his policies while the hostages were already taken. It's that you can't ignore what led to it, what led to the installing of a government like that. That was part of Carter's fault. Now, Carter, to their credit, they did try a rescue operation. It flopped, and
Mhm.
so I think he was hoping that would help save his um, election, and genuinely was trying to get them out. But there would have been dangers of trying to do a more full scale thing because you could have just all had all those people killed. So it was I don't think there was any good. Once you're in that situation, there aren't great options, and so I don't think. Now, how did they end? Well, because we had a president coming in who they were like actually with Trump. I mean, they were fear you couldn't guarantee what he was going to do, and he was saying no nonsense, and so they released all the hostages basically as he became president because they didn't want to deal with the consequences of that. And that does show the problems of having a weak, ineffectual president who no one respects. We saw that during Carter. We've really seen that during the past 4 years, although, I mean, again, I don't want to sound cruel, but it's not clear how much Biden really was president. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, I feel bad for his mental state, but in any case, the obviously the world did not respect that, and they didn't, which I think is one reason why you had the Ukraine invasion. And then, so in some ways, the last 4 years, if people have experienced that and say you're too young to experience Jimmy Carter, well, just think about the last 4 years and think of Carter as sort of a trial run for that.
Yeah. I mean, and also correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't the hostages released the first day Reagan
Oh
when
yeah,
Reagan was
I think it was a few
inaugurated?
minutes. I think it was a few minutes after his inauguration,
Yeah.
which was their last sort of insult to Carter, was to wait until Reagan had actually taken office.
Wow. Well, I'm sure there's going to be, we're going to leave it there, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot more puff
Well,
pieces written this week. Yeah.
could I just say one other thing? Because I didn't
Yes.
really know about, or I didn't talk about this in my article, but Carter, everyone also talks about his wonderful post-presidency. Well,
Hmm.
maybe he wasn't a good president, but he was this wonderful post-president.
Right.
Okay, yes, he built houses for Habitat for Humanity. He helped eradicate some diseases. Great, fine. But actually, he had a pretty terrible, other than that, post-presidency. And one of his biggest thing was his effort over the past decade to legitimate, and he even talked about that. He was trying to make them legitimate, Hamas. He
Hmm.
met with the leaders of Hamas. He tried to push that they were the legitimate spokespeople of the Palestinian people. He downplayed that they were really terrorists. And so if you're concerned about, this is why there's not a lot of sorrow in among a lot of Israelis about his death, because they view Carter as someone who betrayed them and who did his best to create to the continuing mess we're in. And so that is one particular thing that hasn't been focused on a lot, but his meeting after, like in 2009, his meetings with Hamas and his efforts to legitimate them is something that is not something we should emulate.
Yeah, and he meddled in all kinds of foreign policy
Oh,
stuff
yes.
with you know post presidents after him.
Yeah.
He meddled in their
Yeah.
foreign policy,
Yes. He
which
did.
was not helpful.
Yes, that's true. He didn't just go off into the sunset. So,
Yes, to the peanut farm. Um, well, we're gonna leave it there. And I'm sure, as I said, I'm sure there's going to be, because I think there's, in a, I don't know, is it Thursday? There's going to be the
state
actual
funeral.
state
State,
funeral, I
yeah.
believe. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more pieces written on Carter, Saint Jimmy. So we'll look forward to that. But thank you, John West, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Becket. It's been a delight.